right, so this is the very first card that we're going to be making today. So the very first step is we're going to need to stamp and emboss our image in order to watercolor it. So if you have never embossed before, this is how to do it. So I've got a Versamark pad, which is a watermark pad. It is an ink that stays a little bit sticky, which is perfect for embossing because the embossing powder will stick to it while we're heating it up and it won't blow around. So the piece of paper I have here, when I get the watercolor paper, it usually comes in a 9x12 pad, and I just cut it into quarters. So this one here is 4.5x6, which is bigger than we need for our card. But what I like to do is stamp and emboss it in the larger piece, and then I will cut it down so that I can make, if I happen to have stamped it a little bit crooked or whatever, I can straighten it out, or if I can just judge a little bit better how I want it to be on my card. So I'm going to tap the excess off, put this back in my container, and then right now the embossing powder is just sticking on the ink. If I just leave it like this, the ink will eventually dry and the powder will just fall off. So I need to use a heat gun in order to melt it. Now you have to use a heat gun. A blow dryer will not work with this. A blow dryer will just blow air and will end up blowing the powder off. A heat gun emits heat, so the powder will melt where it is. So you can see how it has changed from the heat gun. You'll notice that as I'm doing it, I'm moving the heat gun around slowly. I'm not doing this. By doing this, I'm just spreading the heat around and it's going to end up taking too long or take longer. It will eventually work, but it's just going to take longer. So I slowly move it around as it's melting, and I typically have it held so that I can see it in the light and I can see exactly when it changes. And then I've got the heat gun probably a couple inches away from my paper. I don't want to burn the paper. You can burn the paper if you put it too close. And also make sure the heat gun is pointed away from you because it does get quite hot. We're all melted. You'll also notice that as I got towards the end, I moved the heat gun around faster, and that's because it was warm. When I first started, I hadn't used this since yesterday, so it was cold, so it took a little while for it to heat up. But once it heats up, the embossing goes a lot faster. So I've got everything here exactly how I need it, and now I'm going to trim this piece down to fit the front of my card. And then what I do with those trim pieces is I will also emboss my little sentiment. So the piece for my card, I need it to be 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So I basically eyeball it. I see my 5 inches there, and I can know where my blade is, so I can judge exactly what I want to cut off if I need to cut something off. And then this is by 5. All right, so now that is sized for the front of my card. I'm going to put that aside. And then I'm going to take my sentiment stamp and just use one of these scraps. That way I know that the shade is going to match exactly. Watercolor paper is a little bit of an off-white color. So if you use stark white paper, you can tell. And then sometimes it's hard to find a cream colored paper that matches. So this is the easiest, plus you're using scraps. There we go. Cover everything up here. And you'll see that my stamp pad is labeled stained. I have a clean one and a stained one. Because I'm using metallic opaque embossing powder, I'm not going to see the ink underneath it, so I'll typically use my stained one when I'm using a colored or a metallic powder. I'll use my clear one when I want clear powder over top of it, so I want to make sure that I don't have any dirtiness to my stamped image. There we go. So our pieces are those pieces. The image is all cut. I'm just going to cut this down here while I have my trimmer nearby. So I can measure this right now too. So this is 1.5 inches by, 1 second here. Better to measure it this way. Just slightly bigger than 1/2 inch. So I have a piece of gold cardstock here that I'm going to use to mat it. And I'm going to cut this 3/4 inch. So I'm doing this just 1/4 inch bigger than this piece here. So it's got 1/8 inch mat around it. So what did I say this was, 1.5 inches? Yeah, so this needs to be 1 3/4 inches. So I've got these pieces ready for when I am gluing them together. And it looks like this is a little bit too long. I'm just going to cut a tad off of that. There we go. Perfect. So I've got that ready for when I need it. Might as well do all the embossing and stuff while we're at it, or while we've got it all out. All right, I will see you in the next video and we will start to watercolor.